Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, as you settle into the stillness of your room, surrounded by quiet and shadows and the slow rhythm of your breath, allow yourself to drift gently backward through time, not to the thunder of revolutions or the clash of great ideologies, but into something quieter, something more human. Let go of the day's thoughts as you imagine yourself floating through falling snow, past dimly glowing street lamps and the low hum of apartment lights, until you find yourself in a world not often seen through the lens of ordinary life, the Soviet Union, not as a force of history, but as a place where people cooked, slept, dreamed, and simply lived. Forget the headlines and the propaganda for now, and listen instead for the soft clatter of porcelain teacups in a cramped kitchen, the rustling of a wool shawl pulled around tired shoulders, the hiss of a radiator struggling to heat a long hallway. We are entering a world built not just on ideology, but on habit, on patience, on waiting in lines, and on finding warmth in the simplest of things: a steaming mug of black tea, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in waxed paper, the distant sound of a neighbor playing an accordion behind closed doors. Let your thoughts drift like smoke curling upward from a stovetop kettle, and feel the tension in your body loosen as we slip into the slow, repetitive comfort of life in a Soviet apartment block where time passed not in headlines, but in routines quiet, enduring, and strangely peaceful. As we drift a little deeper into this world, let your mind follow the sound of quiet footsteps echoing in a concrete stairwell, each step softened by worn slippers and the creak of iron railings, each landing identical to the one before, painted in fading shades of government-issued green, the color of institutional calm, chipped in places, marked by the invisible brush of thousands of hands passing through year after year. Imagine now that you are climbing slowly, almost floating upward through this stairwell, not in haste or effort, but with the slow curiosity of a dream, until you reach a door plane, heavy painted in dull brown or faded blue, and you hear the faint shuffle of life behind it, the clink of a spoon. Against glass, a soft radio murmuring, the faint laugh of a child echoing from another room. This is your entrance into a typical Soviet apartment, not grand, not luxurious, but familiar, repetitive, and filled with quiet endurance, the kind of space that millions of people called home, not because it was chosen, but because it was assigned, handed over by the bureaucratic machinery that governs so much of daily life in the USSR. The apartment itself is modest, almost sparse, with 3 or 4 rooms divided not by luxury, but by necessity, a main room with a couch that unfolds into a bed, shelves filled with state-printed books arranged with careful pride, a low table with a crocheted doily resting beneath a vase of plastic, flowers, unchanged for years. The walls are covered in wallpaper that was applied long ago, perhaps in the 1960s, or even earlier, faded with time, patterned with quiet florals or geometric repeats, peeling slightly in the corners where the glue has surrendered to decades of humidity and wear. On one wall, a painting or reproduction hangs crookedly, perhaps a forest scene with a lake, or a portrait of Lenin that still remains out of habit, no longer ideological, just there, a part of the room as familiar as the old rug beneath your feet, its patterns worn thin by the rhythm of everyday footsteps. The kitchen, small and functional, is the heart of this home, not by design, but by reality, a space where family life unfolds with the clatter of enamel pots, the smell of boiled potatoes and pickled cabbage, and the low whistle of a kettle that never quite stops boiling. There is a refrigerator, small by modern standards, humming with age and patched with magnets from unknown origins, a reminder of better times, of trips taken or long-forgotten promotions, and inside, there are the essentials: a jar of mayonnaise, a bottle of kefir, a few eggs, perhaps a wedge off, hard cheese wrapped in waxed paper. The gas stove, white with rusted edges, is a familiar presence, always there, always ready, and its surface bears the marks of thousands of meals cooked over the years, soups that simmered for hours, buckwheat porridge in the morning, thin pancakes flipped with care and served with jam or sour cream on quiet weekends. There are no granite countertops, no espresso machines, No gleaming chrome appliances here, only the enduring tools of survival, inherited from mother to daughter, neighbor to friend, carried through decades of sameness and simplicity, each piece with a story, each item treated with a kind of reverence born from scarcity. And in the evening, as the sky darkens outside and the glow of street lamps filters in through sheer curtains often homemade, embroidered with quiet flowers, the apartment becomes a kind of sanctuary, not grand, but deeply human, a space where children read by yellowing light, where elders knit quietly in armchairs, where the television hums gently in the background, always present, always offering a glimpse of something beyond. The television, often an old unit with wood-paneled sides and clunky dials, might show an approved film, a state concert, or a nature documentary with sweeping shots of Russian landscapes, forests, mountains, snow-covered roads, all delivered in a slow, dignified voice that soothes rather than excites. The living room, if it can be called that, is also the bedroom, the guest room, the study, a multi-purpose space that adapts through careful folding and rearrangement, where a couch becomes a bed, a table becomes a desk, and a wardrobe becomes a place to store not just clothes, but myriads, boxes of old letters, bundles of photographs, worn slippers, and hand-knit scarves that still carry the faint scent of mothballs and lavender soap. Privacy is rare here, and yet the family moves in a quiet choreography of understanding, stepping around each other, speaking in soft tones, respecting the boundaries marked not by walls, but by glances and gestures and the quiet wisdom of sharing space. In the corner, there may be a fish tank or a houseplant that leans toward the light, a sign of life, of care, of the small joys that made up daily existence, because even under the weight of regulation and control, the human spirit found moments of warmth, of beauty, of home. And perhaps, as you settle into this vision, as you imagine sitting in that warm room with its slightly flickering light bulb and its worn but familiar chairs, you feel a kind of calm, not the excitement of a grand story, but the gentle hum of ordinary life, repeated endlessly, safely, for years and years, wrapped in the slow rhythm of evenings, meals, memories, and sleep. Outside, the winter night presses gently against the windows, snow swirling softly through yellow streetlight, the city hushed beneath a blanket of frost, and inside, someone brews a final cup of tea, leans back in their chair, and lets the day dissolve into quiet. Let your mind now wander to a quiet street, early in the morning, the air crisp with the breath of winter, or perhaps damp with the scent of spring thaw, and in the stillness, you see a small line beginning to form outside a shop with fogged-up windows and a flickering sign, a cue not of chaos or urgency, but of quiet, practiced patience, as if waiting were simply part of the rhythm of life. The people in line are wrapped in thick coats and fur-lined hats, their collars pulled up high, their scarves tucked tightly around their necks, and they hold their places not with frustration, but with calm resolve, because they know, as all Soviet citizens knew, that the best things, or even the most ordinary things, rarely came easily, and that sometimes a good sausage or a fresh loaf of black bread was worth the wait. This is the world of Soviet food, not abundance, not variety, but survival shaped by shortages, rationing, and a complex system that often made the simplest pleasures feel like small victories. Step now into the kitchen once more, not a kitchen of gleaming tile and polished steel, but a humble space with linoleum floors, faded cabinets, and the hum of a refrigerator that never quite shuts off. And let's explore the meals that sustained millions, day after day, through decades of repetition and resilience. At the heart of every meal was bread dense, dark rye bread, often with a slightly sour taste, sliced thick and served with everything, from cabbage soup to pickled fish, from sweetened tea to creamy spreads made from crushed beans or liver PT, and when fresh, its aroma filled the apartment with a warmth that no amount of cold outside could touch. Next came potatoes boiled, mashed, fried, or baked, a reliable companion in nearly every dish, and not just a food, but a lifeline, filling and familiar, grown in collective farms and hauled in burlap sacks, stored in balconies or cellars where they'd last through long winters. Soups, too, played a central role, not delicate consommes or rich bisques, but hearty, earthy broths like borscht, made from beets and cabbage, simmered with onions, garlic, and the occasional bone for flavor. A dish that was as much about nourishment as it was about memory, served steaming hot in enamel bowls, often with a dollop of sour cream and a crust of bread. There was also shich, a cabbage soup that stretched the budget and warmed the body, and solyanka, a salty, spicy mix of meats and pickles dishes that may not have been glamorous, but that carried with them the echoes of grandparents, of tradition, of survival. Meat, when available, was rationed and cherished a small slab of pork or beef, cooked slowly to make it tender, or ground into cutlets and fried with onions, and on days when it wasn't available, which was often, people made do with eggs, canned fish, or tvarog, a soft cheese that could be sweetened for breakfast or served plain for dinner. The fridge, small and humming, might hold leftovers in reused jars, pieces of hard candy in a cup, or a single piece of smoked sausage wrapped carefully in wax paper, and every item, no matter how humble, was treated with respect, never wasted, always used. Sweets were rare and treasured. A tin of chocolates saved for holidays, a cake baked with layers of jam and buttercream when ingredients could be found, or a few cubes of sugar dropped into black tea and stirred slowly, sipped while talking about nothing and everything at once. Sometimes there were luxuries: tangerines at New Year's, a bottle of Georgian wine for a birthday, or, if one was very lucky, a tin of condensed milk to pour over pancakes. But more often, there was the comfort of routine, the stability of repetition, the quiet pride in making something from little. Shopping for food was not a matter of preference or taste. It was an act of strategy, of planning, of patience, with women rising early to visit multiple shops, checking for availability, standing in long queues, and then trading or bartering with neighbors when something was missing, which it almost always was. The phrase "got lucky" was often heard not for winning anything grand, but simply for finding bananas at the market, or a good piece of beef, or even toilet paper, because in a world where goods were unevenly distributed, luck played a larger role than choice. Store shelves, lined with identical tins and pickled jars, often sat half empty, and signs reading "No milk or bread is finished" were not unusual, but expected, absorbed into daily life like the weather or the news. And yet, despite the grayness, the shortages, the sameness, people found ways to celebrate, to share, to mark occasions with food and warmth and laughter. Birthdays meant a table filled with dishes, each prepared with care, no matter how simple: Olivier salad made with canned peas and mayonnaise, herring under a coat of beets, fried pierogies stuffed with mushrooms, or mashed potatoes, a bottle of vodka opened and passed around, laughter filling the air, even as the radio played a soft Soviet ballad in the background. In these moments, the kitchen became more than a place to cook. It became a space of connection, of family, of escape, a place where stories were shared, secrets whispered, where grandparents told tales of the war, of hunger, of love, where children learned how to knead dough, how to peel carrots. Just so, how to stir the pot slowly, patiently, until it was done. And so, even in scarcity, even in repetition, food became a thread that wove life together, not in indulgence, but in intimacy, in resilience, in the small joys that whispered, "We are still here, we still gather, we still share." You now, let that image stay with you now: the warm kitchen, the soft steam of soup rising from a chipped pot, the flicker of a stove light above a sleepy table, the quiet rustle of a newspaper, the gentle tap of a spoon against porcelain, the slow, steady rhythm of a home that endures. Outside, the city moves slowly, caught in snow or thaw or rain, and inside, life continues, not loudly, but deeply, in the scent of dill, the scrape of a knife, the hush of voices late at night, and the promise that tomorrow, once again, there will be tea. Now gently let your thoughts drift back to the simple, tender world of childhood. Not the childhood of fairy tales or brightly colored cartoons, but one shaped by snow-covered sidewalks, the scent of boiled potatoes in the air, and the soft clack of leather shoes echoing down long school corridors lined with posters of Lenin and Red Stars. In the Soviet Union, being a child meant learning early that life was not just about games or play, but also about purpose, that even the smallest citizen had a role to fulfill in building a better, collective future, and yet, despite the slogans and rules, there were still moments of quiet wonder, of play, of dreaming, and of friendship tucked gently between the pages of a state-issued school book. Morning began, not with cartoons or surreal, but with a routine as predictable as sunrise, the rustle of uniforms being buttoned up, the scrape of metal lunch tins packed with simple food, and the distant hum of the radio, offering patriotic music or news headlines over breakfast. Uniforms were the same for nearly everyone: dark dresses or suits, white collars, red scarves tied proudly around necks for most children were young pioneers, members of the Soviet youth organization that promised discipline, community, and loyalty to the ideals of socialism, even as children were still learning how to tie their own shoes. Walking to school, whether in the deep snows of Siberia or the leafy streets of Leningrad, was often done alone or with a sibling. The air cold but familiar, the path known by heart, past blocky gray apartment buildings, and the distant scent of coal fires or fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. And when the children arrived with cold noses and stiff fingers, they entered a world where everything had its place, and every day followed a quiet rhythm of bells, lessons, and rituals. Desks were neatly arranged in rows, blackboards loomed large at the front, and portraits of Lenin or Marx often looked down from the walls, with stern but silent gazes, a reminder that education was not only about math or language, but also about ideology, about shaping the perfect Soviet citizen. Each school day began with formality: students standing at attention, hands by their sides, reciting pledges, singing the national anthem, and sometimes reading aloud from approved texts that praised the state, the workers, and the collective spirit of the people, a tone that would shape their thinking for years to come. Lessons themselves were rigorous in consistent math, literature, history, physics, and always Russian language and grammar taught with chalk and repetition, with discipline and seriousness, and yet often delivered by kind and devoted teachers who understood the burdens of their own youth and tried gently to make room for wonder between the lines. There were textbooks, thick and durable, passed down from student to student in notebooks, covered in brown paper, carefully labeled with tidy handwriting in blue ink, each line meant to be exact, each page a quiet exercise in control. And while the curriculum was often dry, filled with phrases about tractors and production and heroic workers, many children still found joy in the stories of Pushkin, the puzzles of mathematics, or the beauty of language, small sparks of inspiration tucked into a system designed for conformity. Recess was not a riot of playground equipment or bright plastic slides. It was a short break, sometimes taken inside if the weather was bitter, with quiet games of tag or whispered stories exchanged in corners, and on warmer days, children might play outside in gravel lots or behind the school, building, kicking worn soccer balls, or drawing in the dust with sticks. Lunch was simple, eaten in school cafeterias, where large metal trays were filled with cabbage soup, buckwheat kasha, perhaps a small meat patty, and a cup of warm compote made from dried fruits, not a feast, but enough to keep young stomachs from growling through the long afternoon lessons. For many students, the day ended with after-school programs activities designed to shape the ideal young Soviet mind and body, like music lessons, science clubs, or sports practices, all held in the same no-frills buildings with flickering lights and the scent of chalk and sweat lingering in the air. Some children attended pioneer camps in the summer vast lakeside retreats, where mornings began with flag-raising ceremonies and the singing of anthems, where cabins were filled with bunk beds and laughter, and where activities like hiking, swimming, and crafting were all carried out under the watchful eyes of young leaders and posters urging loyalty to the motherland. Home, for many children, meant small apartments shared with siblings, parents, and sometimes grandparents, where space was tight, but love was often abundant, and in the evenings, Children did homework by the light of a single bulb, while the radio played softly or a parent read the paper with tired eyes. There were toys, though not many in books, often well loved, with creased pages and faded covers, and above all, there were imaginations, vast and wild, dreaming of space travel, or heroism, or simple happiness, unshackled by the limits of ideology. Despite the pressure to conform, children still found ways to be children, to giggle at jokes whispered behind textbooks, to dream of adventures, to build forts from chairs and blankets, to imagine a future far beyond the gray buildings that lined their world. And so, in the quiet corners of classrooms, in the soft creases of school uniforms, in the murmur of pencil against paper, Soviet childhood unfolded, not always joyfully, not always freely, but with resilience, with innocence, and with the quiet strength of young minds learning how to live, how to grow, how to hope. As your eyes begin to close and your breath begins to slow, let yourself imagine a classroom bathed in morning light, the dust in the air catching the sun like tiny gold flecks, a child looking out the window, not listening to the lesson, but dreaming instead of something more. Something beyond, something gently stirring in the silence of growing up behind the curtain. Let your body soften now. Let your breath grow slower and picture a world where the sound of footsteps on frosted pavement echoed beneath smoky morning skies, where the day began not with alarm clocks buzzing in the chaos of a digital world, but with the dull hum of radiators, the shuffle of boots in communal hallways, and the scent of rye bread and factory dust carried in the cold morning air. In the Soviet Union, adulthood was not an individual journey, but a collective responsibility, and to be a worker meant not only earning a wage or keeping a routine, but embodying the values of an entire state to labor for the people, the system, and the dream, even when that dream flickered faintly, behind layers of routine and silent exhaustion. A worker's morning might begin at dawn, in a one-bedroom apartment shared by many, father rising early to iron his uniform shirt, while mother prepared something warm on the small stove, perhaps kasha, or thick slices of bread with butter, and sweet black tea poured from a chipped ceramic pot. The apartment was simple, with linoleum floors, patterned wallpaper peeling at the corners, and windows fogged by the cold, but every item had purpose, every shelf filled with books, porcelain figurines, and tokens of a life lived under rationing, cues, and quiet hope. Bundled in coats and scarves, workers made their way through snow-dusted courtyards and past bulletin boards plastered with state slogans and labor statistics, each poster urging them to give just a little more to exceed their quota, to honor the worker heroes of the revolution, to build a brighter tomorrow with today's sacrifice. Their workplaces varied from roaring factories, where sparks flew like fireflies in the darkness, to gray government offices where typewriters clacked in endless rhythm from vast collective farms under open skies, to quiet design bureaus where engineers toiled over schematics by the dim light of desk lamps. And wherever they went, one truth remained: employment was not optional. It was mandatory, not simply a matter of survival, but a fundamental part of life in a society where the state was both employer and overseer, protector and judge. A factory worker might spend the day among metal presses and conveyor belts, operating machines that produced parts for tractors, airplanes, or radios, his hands roughened by steel, his ears dulled by the constant clatter of industry, and his mind focused not on profits or promotions, but on fulfilling the plan, meeting the target, contributing to the grand economic vision drawn up far away in distant offices. In cities, many women worked too in textile mills and schools, as doctors, engineers, or clerks, balancing long hours of labor with the responsibilities of motherhood and domestic life, for though equality was promised, the burden often fell heavier on their shoulders, carried with quiet strength. Through years of repetition and care, the workday was structured, measured by time clocks and quotas, filled with meetings where superiors praised or chastised based on statistics, sometimes exaggerated, always scrutinized, and at its core was a silent agreement. The people would work, and the state would provide not luxury, not choice, but security and sameness. There were rewards for the most productive medals, banners, sometimes better apartments or food packages, and shame for those who failed to meet expectations, who showed up late, or questioned orders too loudly for while unions existed. They served the system, not the individual, and dissent was a whisper best left unspoken. And yet, in spite of the rigid structure and constant surveillance, many workers found pride in their roles in crafting something with their hands, in fixing machines, in organizing inventory's simple tasks that became rituals, that gave meaning to days spent in endless repetition. Lunchtime was short, often eaten in noisy cafeterias, filled with the aroma of cabbage soup, cutlets, and dense rye bread. Conversations were cautious, sometimes lively, but always aware of who might be listening. For even among friends, politics was rarely discussed openly unless you were certain, truly certain of loyalty. After work, the city's slowly dimmed lights flickered on behind frost-touched windows. Buses rumbled down icy streets, and people returned to the warmth of home, tired, perhaps, but not broken, filled with stories they might never tell, with dreams folded quietly between the lines of official slogans. Some workers relaxed by watching television, though choices were limited. Perhaps a black and white film, a news report, or a state-approved variety show filled with songs and smiling performers in traditional dress. And in these moments, the quiet uniformity of life settled over them like a blanket, heavy and familiar. And still, there were moments of joy, small ones, in a well-made chair, a repaired engine, a warm meal, a shared joke whispered during break time, reminders that even within a system designed to control, people remained human, capable of connection, humor, and resilience. On weekends, they rested not in luxury, but in simplicity, perhaps visiting a park, queuing for groceries, or reading a well-worn book borrowed from the local library. For leisure was not abundant, but it existed, shaped by the rhythms of a society that offered routine as comfort and sameness as security. And so, the Soviet worker carried on day after day, decade after decade, not because they believed every word written on the factory wall, but because life was not always about belief. Sometimes it was simply about getting through the day, providing for your family, and finding small, quiet pieces of dignity in a world that rarely offered more. Now, as your eyelids grow heavier and your thoughts begin to float like smoke rising above a chimney stack, imagine a vast factory at dusk, the machines silent, the lights slowly dimming, workers slipping into the night with heavy boots and lighter hearts, their breath visible in the cold, their dreams invisible but still alive, whispered only to the stars above the gray skyline. Now, sink deeper into your pillow. The noise of factories fades. The gray buildings grow quiet, and the air softens with the scent of tea and snow. In the Soviet Union, even rest had a pattern. Free time was structured, holidays were planned, and even vacations followed the rhythms set by the state. Yet despite it all, people found moments of peace, quiet, simple, and deeply human. Weekends were precious, a time to breathe. Families might walk together beneath the pine trees in a city park, arms wrapped in thick coats, eyes half closed against the wind. The sound of boots crunching on snow was the lullaby of winter life. Inside their homes, life slowed. Children played with simple toys, carved wooden animals, dolls dressed in cloth, or watched cartoons on flickering screens. Adults read books, wrote letters, or simply sat near the heater, sipping tea and remembering quieter times. Vacations, when granted, were sometimes spent at state-run resort sanatoriums beside lakes, or in the mountains where workers were offered rest, mineral baths, and lectures on health and productivity. It was peaceful, in its own way, a kind of manufactured calm, but to many, it still felt like freedom. There were public holidays, 2 grand parades on May Day or Revolution Day, when music echoed through the streets and banners waved in the wind. Children held balloons. Soldiers marched in unison. And though the speeches were always the same, the celebration gave people a reason to smile. Yet behind closed doors, dreams stirred. Some dreamed of more, not luxury or fame, but of books they couldn't read, music they couldn't hear, lives they couldn't live. Not everyone wished to escape, but many longed for choice, and in the quiet of night, lying on stiff mattresses beneath wallpapered ceilings, thoughts drifted to other places, where shops were full, newspapers uncensored, and dreams didn't need permission. Still, even within these limits, there was laughter. There was love. There were birthdays with homemade cakes, weddings with music and dancing, and small, beautiful joys unplanned, unapproved but deeply real. And now, dear listener, you lie here in the safety of your own time. Let your thoughts drift like smoke from a chimney above a snowy Moscow street. Let your breath slow, soft, and steady. For though the Soviet Union is gone, its memories remain as quiet echoes in history's long sleep,